All right, let's get ready to jump into a world of knights and maybe shatter some of those illusions we have about them.
Yeah, it's really interesting how much our image of knights has been shaped by Hollywood and all those stories.
Definitely. I mean, we all have that picture in our minds, right? We're tackling the reality of knights today, and we've got this really great article
Oh, yeah.
called The Reality of Knights. And it is packed with stuff that is going to make you rethink pretty much everything you thought you knew about knights.
Yeah, for sure.
So the big question I think we have to start off with is, were knights these noble paragons of chivalry, or was there little something more to the story?
Yeah, well, to really understand knights, I think we have to begin with their training.
Okay.
And you might be surprised to hear just how young it all began. I mean, imagine like sending your kid off
So
to night school at 7 years old.
7. That's insane. They're like barely out of kindergarten.
I know.
I can't even imagine what that training involved. I mean, was it all just sword fighting and horseback riding?
Yeah. Well, those were definitely like the key elements, but the article talks about these 7 points of agility that every knight in training had to master.
Okay.
And some of them might surprise you, like dancing was one of them.
Dancing. What? Why would dancing be important for a knight?
Well, believe it or not, dancing was actually seen as crucial for balance and coordination
Oh,
and social grace.
yeah.
Even it was like their medieval multitasking skill, I guess.
Right.
But on a more serious note, though, the article does dive into some of the harsher realities of that training, too.
Yeah, I was reading about that where they'd make these kids like slaughter livestock as part of their training. It just seems a bit extreme, you know what I mean? Like, was that really necessary to make them good at combat, or was there something more to it, like desensitizing them to violence, maybe?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it gets at the core of what knighthood was really all about.
Okay.
I mean, this wasn't just like a job, right? It was a
Yeah.
lifelong commitment, almost a social contract.
Hmm.
Knights would pledge their service to lords in exchange for land. And these land grants were called fiefs.
Right.
So it was really this deeply intertwined system of politics and economics and military power.
So becoming a knight wasn't just about like being this incredible warrior. It was about upholding this whole social order.
Exactly. And that brings us to this concept of chivalry,
Yeah.
something we tend to romanticize. But the article paints a much more nuanced picture, I think.
Yeah, I think we all have that image in our minds of the chivalrous knight rescuing damsels and just being all honorable and everything.
Right.
But the article seems to suggest that the reality was often far less idealistic.
Definitely. I mean, while these codes of chivalry did exist, they promoted all these virtues, right? Courage, honor, protection of the weak. But the historical evidence that we have suggests that these ideals weren't always followed, especially like in the heat of battle or during those violent feuds that were so common back then.
So were these codes of chivalry just like lip service then? Did they actually have any impact on how knights behaved?
It's a tough question to answer. I mean, the article mentions the church and the nobility trying to enforce these codes,
Okay.
but it seems like it was this constant battle to actually bridge that gap between the ideal and the reality.
Right.
It really makes you wonder if chivalry was maybe more aspirational than a set of principles that people aimed for but maybe didn't always achieve.
It's like human nature probably got in the way sometimes.
Yeah.
Speaking of less than noble activities, the article also goes into tournaments, and those weren't exactly the friendly competitions we see in the movies, right?
Not even close. They
Yeah.
were more like these brutal spectacles. Really a form of entertainment, but also a training ground for warfare.
Right.
But let's be real, they were brutal.
Oh, yeah.
The article doesn't shy away from talking about the injuries and even deaths
Oh, wow.
that happened all the time at these tournaments.
Yeah. I mean, I guess with all that armor and weaponry, that kind of makes sense. What always gets me is this whole ransom thing that they do. Like, you could be captured during a tournament, and your family would have to pay to get you back.
Yeah, it was a high-stakes game, both on and off the field.
Mm.
Imagine the pressure on those families trying to, like, scramble to get enough money to free their loved one.
Oh, man, yeah.
It really adds another layer to the whole knightly world, doesn't it? It wasn't all just glory and heroism. There was a lot of economics and power dynamics at play, too,
Right. And probably a lot of really worried moms back at home.
for sure.
Speaking of shifting dynamics, let's talk about how the role of knights in warfare changed over time.
Okay.
Because it seems like that really evolved.
It did. It really did. In the early medieval period, knights were like the elite core of any army, right? You had these heavily armored mounted warriors who could basically dominate the battlefield.
Yeah, it said that like 20 to 30% of an army was made up of knights.
Yeah, that's a lot of heavy cavalry.
That's a lot of guys charging around on horses.
Exactly. But I was reading that by the time of the Crusades, their numbers actually started to dwindle.
Really?
Yeah.
Why was that?
Well, there were a few factors at play.
Okay.
Remember how we were talking about those early medieval battles being these kind of chaotic melees?
Mm-hmm.
Well, warfare was becoming much more organized and strategic.
Right.
Larger armies with different types of soldiers working together.
Okay.
Suddenly, charging in on horseback wasn't always the most effective strategy.
Right.
And then you have the rise of things like archers and pikemen.
Yeah, those guys could really take down a knight.
They could. They really could. So knights had to adapt to these changes.
It's interesting to think about that. I mean, there were still these highly skilled warriors, though, right?
Oh, absolutely. And that's where their training and experience really became valuable.
Okay.
Instead of being just fighters, the article suggests they transitioned into more of a leadership role.
Okay.
So like commanders and strategists coordinating these larger, more complex armies.
That makes sense. It wasn't just about brute force anymore. It was about strategy and tactics.
Exactly. And this shift in their role also kind of mirrored what was happening in society in general.
How so?
Well, as their military role was declining, knights became more focused on land ownership and their political influence.
Oh, so like those fiefs we were talking about before.
Exactly. They became even more important as a source of power and wealth.
So they went from warriors to more like lords and landowners?
Pretty much, they were still a really important part of the social hierarchy, but their power base was definitely changing.
Interesting.
Now, with all this talk about knights becoming less focused on the military side of things, you might be wondering what happened to that whole idea of chivalry.
Right. Did that just kind of fade away?
Well, that's where things get really fascinating.
Okay.
Because even though the reality of knighthood was evolving, chivalry as an ideal continued to have this allure.
Okay.
I mean, think about all those stories of King Arthur and his knights.
Yeah.
Those were super popular during this same period.
So people were clinging to that image of the noble knight, even if the reality was becoming a bit more complicated.
Exactly. Those stories, with all their themes of courage and honor and courtly love, really resonated with people.
Yeah.
They offered a sense of order and morality in a world that was honestly pretty chaotic.
So they gave people something to aspire to, maybe even a way to make sense of the changing world around them.
I think so.
But it does make you wonder, were there any real-life knights who actually embodied those chivalric ideals, or was it all just stories?
Ah, that's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's one that historians are still debating today.
Okay.
The problem is, it's really hard to separate fact from fiction
Yeah.
when we're dealing with figures from centuries ago.
Right.
We have to rely on these accounts that were often biased or embellished.
It was like trying to solve a mystery with only half the clues.
Yeah, pretty much so.
Yeah.
Are there any knights that historians generally agree were like the real deal when it comes to chivalry?
Yeah, who comes to mind?
Well, one figure who often comes up is William Marshall.
Okay.
He was a 12th century knight,
Right.
but he's actually been called the greatest knight that ever lived.
Wow, the greatest knight. That's a pretty big title to live up to.
It is. He served multiple kings, fought in countless battles, and was a champion in tournaments.
Wow.
He was a true warrior, but what really set him apart was his reputation for honor and fairness and loyalty.
So he was like the real deal, a knight who actually walked the walk.
It seems that way. He really embodied those chivalric virtues that were often more idealized than practiced.
Wow, that's impressive.
Now, another interesting example is Edward the Black Prince.
The Black Prince. Okay, that sounds pretty badass. What's his story?
He was the son of King Edward III of England,
Okay.
and he was this fierce warrior known for his victories in battles like Crécy and Poitiers during the 100 Years' War.
Okay.
He actually got his nickname from the black armor that he wore.
Oh, so he was like all about crushing his enemies, not so much about courtly love.
Well, that's where things get a little more complicated.
Okay.
While he was definitely admired for his military skill and courage, he was also criticized for his brutality,
Oh, really?
especially during the siege of Limoges.
So a knight with some flaws.
Yeah, it kind of makes him seem a little more human, don't you think?
It does, actually.
And it highlights how tricky it can be to judge historical figures by modern standards.
Right.
What we might consider brutal today might have been seen as necessary or even honorable back then.
It's all about context, I guess.
It really is. So we have William Marshall as our potential poster boy for chivalry,
Right.
and then Edward the Black Prince as this more complex figure who was both celebrated and criticized.
It's a good reminder that history is rarely about clear-cut heroes and villains.
Exactly. It's about real people with flaws and contradictions
Mhm.
trying to figure out this complex world.
Which is what makes history so interesting to me. I think it's not just about memorizing dates and battles. It's about understanding those human stories, the motivations, the choices that people made.
And the impact those choices had on their own lives, but also on the course of history.
Definitely. Okay, so we've talked about the evolution of knights in warfare, the complexities of chivalry, and we've even gotten a little glimpse into the lives of some real-life knights.
I feel like we've covered a lot of ground.
We have, but there's one major event that we haven't fully explored yet, and it had a huge impact on knighthood: the Crusades.
Oh, yeah. The Crusades. That feels like a whole other chapter in the story of knights.
It really is.
Okay, so the Crusades, we're talking like centuries of these religious wars, right? I vaguely remember learning about them in school, but it always felt so far off and kind of abstract.
I know what you mean. They might seem like ancient history, but honestly, they had a massive impact on the world, and for knights, they were like a defining era.
Okay.
It's not even just about the battles and the conquests. It's about how these events, like, shaped the whole idea of knighthood.
Okay, so for those of us who maybe need a little refresher,
Yeah.
what were the Crusades all about exactly?
Well, basically, they were this series of holy wars that were sanctioned by the church. And the main goal was to reclaim the Holy Land.
Okay.
Jerusalem and other places that were considered sacred to Christianity from Muslim rule. Right, right. I remember that part. And I remember that European knights were pretty gung-ho about signing up for these crusades.
Yeah.
It seemed like the ultimate adventure, right? A chance to prove your faith and your fighting skills, and maybe even come back with some treasure.
That was definitely the image that was being
yeah.
pushed. Yeah, I mean, you got to imagine for a knight who was raised on all those tales of chivalry and religious devotion, the idea of going to fight in a holy war would have been super powerful.
Totally. But I'm guessing it wasn't all just glorious battles and triumphant returns.
Yeah, you guessed it. The reality of the Crusades was definitely far from those romanticized ideas.
The article mentioned that the percentage of knights in armies actually went down during the Crusades, which seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does seem that way at first, right?
Yeah.
But remember we were talking earlier about how warfare was becoming more complex? It involved larger armies with all these different types of soldiers. Well, the Crusades were huge undertakings. I mean, they required massive numbers of troops, tons of logistical support, and you needed lots of different military approaches. So it wasn't just about knights charging into battle on horseback anymore.
So knights weren't the only ones going on these crusades.
Oh, no, not at all. You had foot soldiers, archers, engineers, even people who specialized in, like, building siege weapons.
Wow.
And this was also a time when new technologies like gunpowder were starting to show up on the battlefield.
Right.
So the Crusades actually sped up those changes we talked about earlier, where warfare became less about individual knights and more about this big coordinated effort involving different troops and strategies.
So in a way, the Crusades kind of forced knights to transition from warriors to more like commanders.
Exactly. They had to adapt to this new, more complex way of fighting.
Right.
And that meant taking on different roles and responsibilities.
Okay.
But the impact of the Crusades goes even deeper than that. They also forced people to kind of rethink what it actually meant to be a knight.
What do you mean by that?
Well, think about it. You have these knights going off to fight in this foreign land, far away from home, often facing crazy hardships and dangers. And they're doing it all in the name of their faith, believing that they're fighting a righteous war. But that kind of experience can really shake up your beliefs, especially when you're seeing the brutality of war firsthand and you're dealing with different cultures and religions.
So like a reality check for these knights.
Yeah, exactly. And the article even talks about how the Crusades led to this growing sense of disillusionment among some knights.
Okay.
They were seeing this gap between the idealized idea of a holy war and then the messy, violent, and sometimes even morally ambiguous reality that was playing out on the ground.
Yeah, it's kind of like that saying, no man is a hero to his valet, right?
Yeah.
Even knights, when you strip away the romanticized armor, they're just people trying to survive and make sense of a complicated world.
Exactly. And that human element, I think, is so important to remember when we study history. It's easy to get caught up in the grand narratives and the big generalizations. But at the end of the day, history is about individuals making choices, facing challenges, and trying to live up to their own ideals, even when those ideals are being put to the test.
That makes me think about all those knights who did return from the Crusades. They must have come back with so many stories and experiences that totally changed how they saw the world.
Yeah.
I mean, did that have any impact on how knighthood was viewed back in Europe?
Oh, absolutely. You can't go through something like that and not come back changed. And the Crusades, with all their complexities and contradictions, they really forced European society to grapple with the evolving role of knights.
Okay.
Like, what does chivalry really mean? And how does Europe relate to the East?
Right. It's amazing to think how these events that happened centuries ago can still have these ripple effects that we feel today. It makes history feel so much more relevant.
I agree.
It's not just something in a textbook. It's a story that's still unfolding.
Yeah. I love that way of looking at it. And that's what makes exploring history so fascinating. It's not about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the connections, the causes and effects, the human stories that shape the world that we live in.
This deep dive has been incredible.
Yeah, it has.
We've covered so much ground, from the training and evolution of knights to the complexities of chivalry, those crazy tournaments, and the huge impact of the Crusades.
I know it's a lot.
It's really made me rethink everything I thought I knew about knights.
It's amazing what you can uncover when you go beyond those surface-level impressions, right?
Yeah.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to learn about knights and chivalry and medieval history in general.
For our listeners who are dying to know more, I definitely recommend checking out that article we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a good one.
It's packed with interesting details and insights.
We'll put a link to it in the show notes. And as always, we encourage you to dive deeper into any topic that sparks your interest. Remember, history is so much more than just dates and battles. It's a living, breathing tapestry of human experience.
And that is a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of knights. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.
Right, the Crusades, so we're talking about centuries of these religious wars, right?
Yeah.
I remember learning about them in school, but to be honest, it all felt kind of far off and abstract,
Yeah, the Crusades might seem like ancient history, but they really had a massive impact on the world. And for knights, they were a defining era. It's not just about the battles and the conquests.
Right.
It's about how those events actually shaped the whole idea of knighthood.
So for those of us who need a little refresher course, what exactly were the Crusades all about?
Okay, so essentially they were a series of holy wars that were sanctioned by the church.
Okay.
With the main goal of reclaiming the Holy Land.
Okay.
Jerusalem and other places that were sacred to Christianity from Muslim rule.
Okay, I remember that. And I remember that European knights were super eager to sign up for these crusades. It was the ultimate adventure, right? A chance to prove your faith and your fighting skills and maybe even come back with some treasure.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, you have to imagine for a knight who was raised on all those tales of chivalry and religious devotion, the idea of fighting in a holy war would have been incredibly powerful.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But I'm guessing it wasn't all glorious battles and triumphant returns.
The reality of the Crusades was a lot more complicated and a lot less glamorous.
The article mentioned that the percentage of knights in armies actually went down during the Crusades.
Yeah.
Which seems kind of counterintuitive.
It does, right? But remember we were talking earlier about how warfare was becoming more complex, larger armies with all these different types of soldiers.
Right.
Well, the Crusades were these massive undertakings.
Okay.
They needed huge numbers of troops, tons of logistical support, and all these different military approaches. It wasn't just about charging into battle on horseback anymore.
So knights weren't the only ones going on these crusades?
No, not at all. You had foot soldiers, archers, engineers,
Wow.
even people who specialized in building siege weapons.
Wow. Okay.
And this was also when new technologies like gunpowder were starting to appear on the battlefield.
Right.
So the Crusades actually sped up all those changes we talked about, where warfare became less about individual knights and more about a coordinated effort with all these different troops and strategies.
So the Crusades kind of pushed knights towards becoming more like commanders.
Exactly. They had to adapt to this new, more complex style of warfare.
Right.
And that meant taking on different roles and responsibilities.
Work.
But the impact of the Crusades goes even deeper than that.
Okay.
They also forced people to kind of reevaluate what it meant to be a knight.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. You have these knights going off to fight in a foreign land, far from home,
Right.
facing all these hardships and dangers. And they're doing it in the name of their faith, believing they're fighting a righteous war.
Yeah.
But that kind of experience can really challenge your beliefs. especially when you're confronted with the brutality of war and the realities of different cultures and religions.
So it was like a reality check for these knights.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
like those chivalric ideals they were supposed to uphold, maybe those didn't always hold up so well in the face of that.
Right. And the article actually talks about how the Crusades led to this growing sense of disillusionment among some knights.
Oh,
They were seeing the gap between those idealized notions of a holy war and the often messy, violent, and morally ambiguous reality.
right. It's like that saying no man is a hero to his valet, right?
Yeah.
Even knights stripped of their romanticized armor are just people trying to survive and make sense of a complicated world.
Absolutely. And I think that human element is so important to remember when we're looking at history.
Definitely.
We get caught up in these grand narratives and generalizations. But at the end of the day, history is about individuals making choices, facing challenges, and trying to live up to their ideals, even when those ideals are tested.
That makes me think about the knights who returned from the Crusades.
Yeah.
They must have come back with so many stories and experiences that just changed their whole view of
Yeah,
things.
definitely.
Did that have an impact on how knighthood was viewed back in Europe?
I think so. So you can't go through something like that and not come back changed.
Right.
And the Crusades, with all their complexities and contradictions, forced European society to really grapple with this evolving role of knights. What does chivalry really mean?
Right.
And how does Europe relate to the East?
Yeah, it's crazy to think how these events that happened centuries ago can still have these ripple effects we feel today.
Yeah.
It makes history feel so much more relevant. Like, it's not just something in a textbook, but a story that's still unfolding.
I love that that's what makes exploring history so fascinating.
Yeah.
It's not about memorizing dates and names, but about understanding those connections, the cause and effect, the human stories that shape the world we live in.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible.
It has been. We covered so much.
We've covered so much ground, from the training and evolution of knights to the complexities of chivalry, those intense tournaments, and the huge impact of the Crusades. It's really made me rethink everything I thought I knew about knights.
It's amazing what you can uncover when you go beyond those surface level impressions, right?
Right.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to learn about knights, chivalry, and medieval history in general.
For our listeners who want to keep exploring, I definitely recommend checking out the article we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
It's packed with interesting details and insights.
Yeah, we'll include a link to it in the show notes. And as always, we encourage you to dive deeper into any topic that sparks your curiosity.
Definitely.
Remember, history is more than just dates and battles. It's this living, breathing tapestry of human experience.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of knights. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.
Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep diving deep.